Hardly ever.
ここは雨がほとんど降っていません。
It hardly ever rains here.
It hardly ever rains here.
It hardly ever rains here.
私はテレビをほとんど見ません。
I hardly ever watch TV.
I hardly ever watch TV.
I hardly ever watch TV.
彼はめったに笑いません。
He hardly ever smiles.
He hardly ever smiles.
He hardly ever smiles.
彼女はほとんど休みません。
She hardly ever takes breaks.
She hardly ever takes breaks.
She hardly ever takes breaks.
彼らはほとんど料理をしません。
They hardly ever cook.
They hardly ever cook.
They hardly ever cook.
彼はほとんど運動をしません。
He hardly ever exercises.
He hardly ever exercises.
He hardly ever exercises.
私はほとんど昼寝をしません。
I hardly ever take naps.
I hardly ever take naps.
I hardly ever take naps.
彼はめったに文句を言いません。
He hardly ever complains.
He hardly ever complains.
He hardly ever complains.
彼女はデザートをほとんど食べません。
She hardly ever eats dessert.
She hardly ever eats dessert.
She hardly ever eats dessert.
彼はスーツをほとんど着ません。
He hardly ever wears suits.
He hardly ever wears suits.
He hardly ever wears suits.
私たちはほとんど喧嘩しません。
We hardly ever argue.
We hardly ever argue.
We hardly ever argue.
彼女はほとんど遅刻しません。
She hardly ever stays late.
She hardly ever stays late.
She hardly ever stays late.
私たちはめったに外出しません。
We hardly ever go out.
We hardly ever go out.
We hardly ever go out.
私はほとんど痛くありません。
I hardly ever get sick.
I hardly ever get sick.
I hardly ever get sick.
私たちは彼にほとんど会いません。
We hardly ever see him.
We hardly ever see him.
We hardly ever see him.